Today, I would like to talk about a touchy subject, and that is going to be on depression. Now, I believe depression is the soul crying out, saying that you are not living as you should. Now, I know many of you may believe that there is, clinical depression, and people are more amped to being sad and others happy, and some people are just depressed. And you can accept that belief if you want, but I believe that is a self-limiting belief system. And as Boethius says, I believe if you are suffering, it is due to a misguided belief system. And that is why I almost believe depression is a good thing, because it is almost a compass telling you that you are walking the wrong path. You are not doing what you should be doing. You need to change, or this will not change. And for that reason, I believe depression is actually beneficial, because it can help you understand when you are and aren't doing things that you should be doing. If you are feeling bad about something you did, if it is causing you to suffer, if your day in and day out life, you wake up and you're miserable and you say, if today was the last day of my life, that would be horrible. And obviously I don't mean it in the sense that, you want to die if you're not depressed, but in the sense that you can be content knowing that you're walking a path true to yourself and you're doing your very best. And you can't pick the expiration date, but you can pick what you're doing when the expiration date comes, or at least the projects you have going, the pursuits that you are aiming at. These things you can choose. Now, I also have an issue with modern therapy. The therapy that is supposed to teach or treat depression and treat other ailments and quote unquote illnesses in people. Because I truly adopt the notion and the idea that oneself should be lifted up by oneself. Because if you cannot lift yourself up and you can only be lifted up by another, then you are still walking with a crutch. You are not healthy if every time a hardship befalls you, you need to talk to somebody and you cannot just deal with it on your own. And that isn't to bash anybody. That isn't to bash people who are therapists, because I do believe in a certain kind of therapy. I believe in therapy like Jungian, Carl Jung, Jungian analysis, people like James Hollis. I think those people are the therapists that we need, because in my opinion, their goal isn't to be your crutch. Their goal is to have you walk on your own. And same with cognitive behavior therapy. The goal of cognitive behavior therapy, and what I have gathered, and in Jungian therapy, is to make it so you develop tools and you come to understand things so that you no longer need a crutch. That when these bouts come, because they come for everybody, I think some people think that they're just the most miserable, wretched people in the world and no one else feels as bad as they do. But that is simply not the case. Everyone gets the sads. Everyone has trouble at times. And the difference is the people who can deal with it and the people who can't. And the people who are living a life in such a way that it's easier to deal with than the people who are living life in such a way where it's almost unbearable, because what they're doing is not in accordance with their nature. And that's why their soul is crying out. Their soul is saying, what are you doing? Why do you disobey? You know you don't want to do this anymore. You know this isn't helping you. This isn't helping society. This is your talents and your skills are wasted in this pursuit. And, if that is truly the case, is it not a good thing that our soul is trying to, quote unquote, wake us up and tell us to change? Tell us to live more in accordance with our nature? Is that not a good thing? But as I said, I don't believe in therapy where, every time you get the SADS, you got to come to me. And I have a schedule, so you got to wait. You got to wait till it works for me. It's like a crutch that you can't always use. Imagine if a doctor gave you a crutch and they said, all right, now you can use this, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, from this time to that time. But any other time, you can't. You're just going to have to deal with it. And, that makes no sense. But that seems to me what therapy is nowadays. But Jungian therapy and cognitive behavior therapy, their goal is not to give you a crutch, but their goal is to heal you. Their goal is to fix your leg. It's like physical therapy. When you're done with physical therapy, you're typically healed again. It's not something you do the rest of your life. They give you exercises to do so that you don't need to go back to physical therapy. And that if you keep up on these exercises, you will be healed. You will be better. And that's what I believe therapy should be. That's what physical therapy is. Why would mental therapy be any different? But I digress. And I want to state the point that, I don't think depression is truly an evil. As I said, it is guiding you to a path you should be walking. It is letting you know you're doing something wrong and you need to change. And you also need to develop tools, because even when you change, even when you do start walking the right path, the uncertainty is still there. The worry is still there. And the depression can still boil up. And that's why you need tools. And that's why you need, in my opinion, to read philosophy, to study philosophy, but not the Kants of the world, even though I have nothing wrong with Kant, but the practical philosophers. The Stoics are, I think, the most practical, but there's other philosophers who are also practical. Montaigne also has practical lessons. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Typically you got to go older, but the Albert Camuses, they also have good advice. But typically you got to go into antiquity, because that's when philosophy wasn't a mere pursuit. It was a way of life. It was how you lived. Back in the day, a philosopher wasn't an academic. He was the guy who took who did cold plunges, who wore barely any clothes in winter to prove that it's a mindset. He was the guy who, like Diogenes, showed that you needed very little to live a happy life. And, philosophy has changed. It's turned into the Wittgensteins, who are so obsessed with grammar, and the Kants, who, grapple with things that don't really matter to try to, I don't know. I've never read Kant or Wittgenstein, so take that with a grain of salt. But from what I've heard, that's kind of what they do. And from what I've heard about Kant, at least, there's only the categorical imperative is beneficial. But, that just takes, You could write the categorical imperative in 2 sentences, and that could be a whole book. And it's the only advice from Kant I've ever heard that's practical. But yeah, the main point on depression is just, oneself should be lifted up by oneself, and don't curse it, because it very well could be the one thing leading you to a life true to yourself, the one thing helping guide you to true peace, true happiness, true tranquility. In the end, would you not be grateful to that thing that would not leave you alone while you were, doing things that you knew were harmful for you? And then you can look back and realize, wow, that saved years of my life and made the years that I still would have had so much more fruitful, so much more enjoyable, so much more beneficial. Would you not be grateful to that friend who gave you the hard advice? And that's, to me, what depression is. And as I said in the beginning, you may disagree. You may think people have disorders, and they very well may. But I don't think sitting here and insisting on that notion is going to help anybody, especially the people who are depressed, because the placebo effect, is proven to be real. And maybe it is, maybe depression is, clinically, and people just are depressed even no matter what they do. Or maybe it's not. But if the placebo has any effect, wouldn't you want to just try to convince people that it's all in their head, that they can work through it, that they can be better, that there's nothing wrong with them, that everyone goes through this, and some people just have a harder time dealing and coping with it, and some people just need to make more drastic changes in their life than others? To me, that is more freeing, that is more beautiful, and that is more beneficial to the human race, and especially the people who believe that they are, or have been told that they are, clinically depressed. And as I said, oneself should be lifted up by oneself. And that's why I don't accept the idea of, antidepressants and things of that nature, because all it is a crutch. All it is a crutch. And why would you settle for a crutch when you could heal your leg? Why would you say, oh, a crutch is enough, when you could become healed? And even more, why would you want a wheelchair when you could have a crutch? There's levels to these things. And some people, it seems like, think that they need to live life in a wheelchair when they could live it walking. And obviously that's metaphysical, mental, physically. It's obvious we don't have control over our body, but that's why we can't put our well-being in our body. That's why all the wisdom literature talks about discarding the flesh, only value internals. And that's why, like I said, I think we need to value the philosophy of antiquity, because that's the practical philosophy. That's the philosophy that helped people get through day-to-day life. Not the philosophy of, Schopenhauer or, Kant. And Schopenhauer I actually kind of like, but he's a little too depressing for me because, I don't know, I think the things you read do have an impact on you. When you read someone complaining about life, page after page, it feels kind of corrupting, even if he's right in a way. I think life is what you deem it to be, and if you read things deeming that life is miserable and horrible, and he has a quote, and it's like, it's bad today, it'll be worse tomorrow until the worst of all comes. And I don't know, there's a certain type of like melancholy humor in Schopenhauer, but still it's like, that's kind of depressing, dude. Like, if you tell me you're depressed and you read Schopenhauer, like, I mean, obviously, I think anyone would be depressed if they read Schopenhauer every day. But I digress. I think I've spoken enough on depression, and I think you get the point.